There is an ongoing war between the Jujutsu Kaisen community, the nature of which I have not personally seen from any other anime. The local Japanese fans and the Western foreign audience can't seem to agree on what the issues are, so in this video I want to take a second to see what these two sides are arguing about, what they are fighting for, and in order to do so, we're going to have to enter the war room. So let's take a look at what makes this anime different and why you can watch the exact same episode and see two totally different realities online. Speaking as a Westerner, having grown up in Ireland, people around me are throwing around words like masterpiece, peak, cinematic. This makes sense. To me, at least. The anime, so far, has been an insane level of quality when it comes to the first two episodes and the animation in the series at large. And the ratings and numbers reflect that hype. As of writing this script, the season 3, episode 4, titled Perfect Preparation, sits at an absurd 9.8 on IMDb. That will most likely fall by the time the video comes out, but regardless, it's an unprecedented achievement. But when it came to Japanese scores, things were a little different, sitting at 78.4%, translating roughly to a 7.8. It was not perfect by any means. The Japanese reaction was one of criticism. The overall grievance seems to lie with how the anime is adapting the source material, and in particular, its tone, and not the animation itself. These arguments are made very loudly on Twitter. However, I'm not particularly interested in the arguments made on Twitter itself, but rather the divide it represents. And I think the first step to that is looking at two examples. Case study 1, episode 3. So episode 3 sits down and explains the culling games. It's one of those episodes that's weirdly important to judge fairly, because it's not built to be exciting. It's built to do something much harder. To take an arc that's notorious for being confusing and make it understandable in a new medium. As a manga reader myself, I can tell you it straight. You can read a massive chunk of the Culling Games arc and still come out thinking, wait, what are the rules? What's going on? What does adding that rule mean? And it isn't because you're dumb. Not entirely anyway. I think it's because the manga's explanation can be dense, and this arc has a lot more moving pieces than any previous arc. So when the anime takes that density, uses visual charts and clean pacing, a lot of people will think it's a good episode. Evidently a lot of people in Japan. From what I've read, it seems that Japanese fans often care about authorial intent and what a scene is trying to say or accomplish. And this episode is setting the board. It's trying to make the next 2 seasons possible. So even though it's not hype, it's not really a shonen episode. It's clear, it's competent, and in terms of being loyal, it fulfills all of those needs perfectly. The Western reaction was mixed, and I'm not going to say that Western fans are dumb or they're incapable of reading the manga. Although funny, and is becoming a stereotype for a reason, plenty of Western fans are manga readers, myself included. And when you talk to them, they often have similar mindsets to the arguments made by the Japanese audience. They care about intent, pacing, on what parts got attention that they didn't think needed it, and parts that were lacking in detail where they would want some. Big difference is that the West has a larger anime-only population, and that changes the conversation dramatically. But because they're watching with an entirely different set of expectations, a manga reader already knows where the arc is going, and they already know how complicated the Culling Games rule set can get. So when episode 3 basically sits you down in a classroom and explains the mechanics, a manga reader is most likely going to go, okay, that's necessary. Anime-only viewers don't have that context. JJK is a show that they associate with momentum, with speed, with fights, and at times those emotional tears. They especially don't expect the first new episode for them to consume after the first 2 episodes were released with the movie to be an episode of exposition. When this episode slows down and starts laying out rules, points, colonies, and win conditions, and possible objectives, I don't blame fans for suddenly thinking that the show has completely changed. hence why the lore dump tag on Twitter was trending. That being said, the quality of the episode at a personal note was genuinely really good, because there is a main difference between manga and anime. Because in manga, if a paragraph is dense, you can just reread it. You can stop. You can backtrack. Hell, you can just check the wiki. Anime doesn't really give you that same feeling of control, unless you pick up your remote, hit the pause button, and then take out your phone and Google it, or rewind. And understandably, a lot of people don't want that density in a weekly series. So not only is the episode going to be judged more by anime-only viewers, it's going to be judged more harshly because of the anime format itself, even if it's objectively good and important. There is some crossover and criticism between this episode and the previous case study. The same general war front is still there, but this battle had something that made it completely different. It was a almost one-to-one homage to a Kill Bill scene. Kill Bill is a two-part revenge film directed by Quentin Tarantino, the first of which was released in 2003 and the second in 2004. The premise of which is that of a story that follows a character known as the Bride, who is betrayed and left for dead by her former lover and boss. After surviving, she goes on a methodical revenge mission against the people responsible. Now, Kill Bill is iconic for many reasons, but in particular, one scene tends to stand out above a lot of the others. And that's when we move back to Jujutsu Kaisen. The scene in question is a scene set in a dojo, where Bill takes on a lot of enemies in a very similar looking environment to the one used in Jujutsu Kaisen. Some of these action shots feel like they are basically rotoscoped. The similarities are insane. However, not close enough to be called plagiarism, it is almost crossing that line. But when it comes to our current conflict, it's when this stops being about adaptation preferences and starts becoming an argument or a battle for respect. From the local side especially, the manga first communities, this might not come off as a cool or interesting reference. It could be interpreted as a director stepping in where he isn't welcome, forcing his own taste into a story and product that he's supposed to be adapting. And personally, I feel like this is why this battle was furious. There's a sort of pride in the original work, and not in some nationalistic way, but this is a story that has already been written. Jujutsu Kaisen isn't a blank canvas. It already has all the texture and emotional language that it needs, and people are protective over it, especially if they've been reading it for years in its original form. Now, I've read and heard a lot of criticism aimed directly at the direction choices, particularly in this episode. Not only in that Kill Bill scene, but also in its sound design and music. And I honestly think it's the strongest criticism. The music choice in parts of this episode felt tone deaf. There are moments that should feel tragic, hollow, almost numb. A character pushed so far past their emotions that they're basically running towards one singular and simple goal. And how do we put sound to that emotion, that situation? It's more American flavor. You get a country-ish Western soundtrack, as it depicts a Japanese character in a Japanese setting. It really shows the director's bias. And as a manga first viewer myself, it's very hard to wave away these criticisms because the adaptation is proving that it's prioritizing style and in this case a homage to the manga's original weight and intent. From that angle, the criticism is completely understandable. People looked in the direction of the director and how his excessive embellishments have affected the work. Although these reactions weren't allowed here in the West, I can only imagine how loud they were locally. And while doing the research for this video, the director of season 3 was announced to be stepping down from Jujutsu Kaisen, finishing this season but not to continue the next. Even without any official confirmation, it's hard not to make this connection to the backlash and the timing of this information and the war at large. I can only hope it's not true, because the anime is genuinely spectacular. And Shota is an incredibly talented director. He's proved that with all of these projects here, and I hope he sticks around in Jujutsu Kaisen personally. However, if he's leaving of his own volition and wants to work on other projects, we'll be following him with a close eye. However, the Western experience, it's completely different. Not because Western fans don't care about the source material, a lot of them do, but the much larger anime-only audience are far more forgiving for large changes like this from the source material. None of it will register as unfaithful for the most part, wouldn't be able to tell. They're not thinking about how they're going to adapt a panel. They're only thinking in terms of, was it an enjoyable experience? Now, I fully understand that that is not the entire audience. A lot of the people I know who watch the show from the West are not like that. However, I have come across far too many than I would like to admit that have told me that they haven't actually watched the entire show, but watch it on TikTok. This might be me inserting bias, but it's a section that I believe is important to acknowledge, and it's a conversation for another video, whether an anime community should judge a show and be vocal on socials about a show if they haven't even consumed the media properly, or if policing that is an issue all its own. Obviously, this doesn't speak for the entire Western community. However, there is one massive difference in the Western and Japanese communities, and that's the version of the story that each side has consumed more prevalently. And that leads us into Japan's reasons. Faithful often means something deeper than adapting a manga one-to-one. It means you preserve the intended meaning and tone of a scene, the emotional weight, the pacing, the silence, the discomfort, the tone, while translating it healthily into the new medium. So when an anime makes a big stylistic choice, like a bold choice in music, a flashy reference, or character changes, while some of the viewers who haven't read the source material will think that these are cool, to others it might seem like over catering to a different audience. And that's why these arguments on Twitter seem to get so heated. The Japanese argument lies with whether a Gege story is being adapted as his story, or whether it's turning into something else. Something that's more marketable for mass impact. This also explains why some Japanese viewers are less impressed by the overwhelming visuals. They're not against spectacle, they just don't want spectacle to overwrite the story they love. Something I found interesting about this topic, and that I mentioned in the intro of this video, is that I have not seen arguments like this for an anime in my experience before. And I think it's mainly down to the fact that open communication between Japanese and Western audiences has become far more easier due to new tools developed on sites like Twitter, where with the click of a button, you're able to completely translate an entire post. I personally have made great use of this while talking to the director of One Punch Man Season 3, and I can see how it could lead to a war like this. However, my conclusion is that this isn't a war between nations or nationality, but it's a war between manga loyalists and casual anime watchers. And the only reason it's been blown out of proportion is because of bias over nationality. All the arguments made by the West in this video can be applied to casual anime watchers. All the arguments made for Japan can be made for a manga purist. And when you look at our case studies, it becomes so clear that this is the case, and it's not some actual geopolitical war. It's people arguing over which adaptation is better, blown out of proportion because of a toxic platform.